Book Sapiens: A Brief History of Humankind by Yuval Noah Harari. Part number 4: The Scientific Revolution. Chapter number 19. And they lived happily ever after. The last 500 years have witnessed a breathtaking series of revolutions. The earth has been united into a single ecological and historical sphere. The economic has grown exponentially, and humankind today enjoys the kind of wealth that used to be the stuff of fairy tales. Science and the Industrial Revolution have given humankind superhuman powers and practically limitless energy. The social order has been completely transformed, as have politics, daily life, and human psychology. But are we happier? Did the wealth humankind accumulated over the last 5 centuries translate into a newfound contentment? Did the discovery of inexhaustible energy resources open before us inexhaustible stores of bliss? Going further back, have the 70 or so turbulent millennia since the cognitive revolution made the world a better place to live? Was the late Neil Armstrong, whose footprint remains intact on the windless moon, happier than the nameless hunter gatherers who 30,000 years ago left their handprint on a wall in Chauvet Cave? If not, what was the point of developing agriculture, cities, writing, coin age empires, science, and industry? Historians seldom ask such questions. They do not ask whether the citizens of Uruk and Babylon were happier than their foraging ancestors, whether the rise of Islam made Egyptians more pleased with their lives, or how the collapse of the European Empire in Africa have influenced the happier of countless millions. Yet these are the most important questions one can ask of history. Most current ideologies and political programs are based on rather flimsy ideas concerning the real source of human happiness. Nationalists believe that the political self-determination is essential for our happiness. Communists postulate that everyone would be blissful under the dictatorship of the proletariat. Capitalists maintain that only the free market can ensure that the greatest happiness of the greatest number by creating economic growth and material abundance, and by teaching people to be self reliant and enterprising. What would happen if serious research were to disprove these hypotheses? If economic growth and the self reliance do not make people happier, what's the benefit of capitalism? What if it turned out the subject of large empires are generally happier than the citizens of independent states, and that, for example, Algerians were happier under French rule than under their own? What would that say about the process of decolonization and the value of national self determination? These are all hypothetical possibilities, because so far historians have avoided raising these questions, not to mention answering them. They have researched the history of just about everything: politics, society, economics, gender, disease, sexuality, food, clothing, yet they have seldom stopped to ask how these influence human happiness. Though few have studied the long term history of happiness, almost every scholar and layperson has some vague preconception about it. In one common view, human capabilities have increased throughout history. Since humans generally use their capabilities to alleviate miseries and fulfill aspirations, it follows that we must be happier than our medieval ancestors, and they must have been happier than Stone Age hunter gatherers. But this progressive account is unconvincing, as we have seen new aptitudes, behaviors, and skills do not necessarily make for better life. When humans learned to farm in the agriculture revolution, their collective power to shape their environment increased. But the lot of many individual humans grew harsher. Peasants had to work harder than foragers to eke out less varied and nutritious food, and they were far more exposed to disease and exploitation. Similarly, the spread of European empires greatly increased the collective power of humankind by circulating ideas, technologies, and crops, and opening new avenues of commerce. Yet, this was hardly good news for millions of Africans, Native Americans, and Aboriginal Australians. Given the proven human propensity for misusing power, it seems naive to believe that the more clout people have, the happier they will be. Some challengers of this view take a diametrically opposed position. They argue for a reverse correlation between human capabilities and happiness. Power corrupts, they say, and as humankind gained more and more power, it created a cold, mechanistic world ill suited to our real needs. Evolution molded our minds and bodies to the life of hunter gatherers. The transition first to agriculture and then to industry has condemned us to living unnatural lives that cannot give full expression to our inherent inclinations and instincts and therefore cannot satisfy our deepest yearnings. Nothing in the comfortable lives of the urban middle class can approach the wild excitement and sheer joy experienced by a forager band on a successful mammoth hunt. Every new invention just puts another mile between us and the Garden of Eden. Yet, this romantic insistence on seeing a dark shadow behind each invention is a dogmatic as the belief in the inevitability of progress. Perhaps we are out of touch with our inner hunter gatherer, but it is not all bad. For instance, over the last 2 centuries, modern medicine has decreased child mortality from 33% to less than 5%. Can anyone doubt that this made a huge contribution to the happiness not only of those children who would otherwise have died, but also of their families and friends? A more nuanced position takes the middle road. Until the scientific revolution, there was no clear correlation between power and happiness. Medieval peasants may indeed have been more miserable than their hunter gatherer forebears, but in the last few centuries, humans have learned to use their capacities more wisely. The triumphs of modern medicine are just one example. Other unprecedented achievements include the steep drop in violence, the virtual disappearance of international wars, and the near elimination of large scale famines. Yet, this too is an our amplification. Firstly, it bases its optimistic assessment on a very small sample of years. The majority of humans began to enjoy the fruits of modern medicine on no earlier than 1850, and the drastic drop in child mortality is a 20th century phenomenon. Mass famine continued to blight much of humanity up to the middle of the 20th century. During communist Chinese Great Leap Forward of 1958 to 1961, somewhere between 10 and 50 million human beings starved to death. International wars became rare only after 1945, largely thanks to the new threat of nuclear annihilation. Hence, through the last few decades have been an unprecedented golden age for humanity. It is too early to know whether this represents a fundamental shift in the currents of history or an ephemeral eddy of good fortune. When judging modernity, it is all too tempting to take the viewpoint of 21st century middle class Westerner. We must not forget the viewpoints of 19th century Welsh coal miner, Chinese opium addict, or Tasmanian Aborigine. Truganini is no less important than Homer Simpson. Secondly, even the brief golden age of the last half century may turn out to have sown the seeds of future catastrophe. Over the last few decades, we have been disturbing the ecological equilibrium of our planet is myriad. New ways with what seem likely to be dire consequences. A lot of evidence indicate that we are destroying the foundations of human prosperity in an orgy of reckless consumption. Finally, we can congratulate ourselves on the unprecedented accomplishment of modern sapiens only if we completely ignore the fate of other animals. Much of the wanted material wealth that shields us from disease and famine was accumulated at the expense of laboratory monkeys, dairy cows, and conveyor belt chickens. Over the last 2 centuries, tens of billions of them have been subjected to a regime of industrial exploitation whose cruelty has no precedent in the annals of planet Earth. If we accept a mere tenth of what animal rights activists are claiming, then modern industrial agriculture might well be the greatest crime in history. When evaluating global happiness, it is wrong to count the happiness only of the upper classes of European or the of men. Perhaps it is also wrong to consider only the happiness of humans. Subchapter Counting Happiness. So far, we have discussed happiness as if it were largely a product of material factors such as health, diet, and wealth. If people are richer and healthier, then they must also be happier. But is that really so obvious? Philosophers, priests, and poets have brooded over the nature of happiness for millennia, and many have concluded that social, ethical, and spiritual factors have a great an impact on our happiness as material conditions. Perhaps people in modern affluent societies suffer greatly from alienation and meaninglessness despite their prosperity, and perhaps our less well to do ancestors found much contentment in community, religion, and a bond with nature. In recent decades, psychologists and biologists have taken up the challenge of studying scientifically what really makes people happy. Is it money, family, genetics, or perhaps virtue? The first step is to define what is to be measured. The generally accepted definition of happiness is subjective well being. Happiness, according to this view, is something I feel inside myself, a sense of either immediate pleasure or long term contentment with the way my life is going. If it's something felt inside, how can it be measured from outside? Presumably, we can do so by asking people to tell us how they feel. So, psychologists or biologists who want to assess how happy people feel give them questionnaires to fill out and tally the result. A typical subjective well-being questionnaires ask interviewees to grade on a scale of 0 to 10 their agreement with statements such as I feel pleased with the way I am, I feel that life is very rewarding, I am optimistic about the future, and life is good. The researcher then adds up all the answers and calculates the interviewees general level of subjective well-being. Such questionnaires are used in order to correlate of happiness with various objective factors. One study might compare 1,000 people who earn $100,000 a year with 1,000 people who earn $50,000. If the study discovered that the first group has an average subjective well-being level of 8.7 while the latter has average of only 7.3, the researcher may reasonably conclude that there is a positive correlation between wealth and subjective well-being. To put it in a simple English, money brings happiness. The same method can be used to examine whether people living in democracies are happier than people living in dictatorships, and whether married people are happier than singles, divorcees, or widowers. This provides a grounding for historians who can examine wealth, political freedom, and divorce rate in the past. If people are happier in democracies and married people are happier than divorcees, a historian has a basis for arguing that the democratization process of last few decades contributed to the happiness of humankind, whereas the growing rates of divorce indicate an opposite trend. This way of thinking is not flawless, but therefore pointing out some of the holes, it is worth considering the findings. An interesting conclusion is that money does indeed bring happiness, but only up to point, and beyond the point it has little significance for people stuck at the bottom of the economic ladder. More money means greater happiness. If you are an American single mother earning $12,000 a year cleaning housing and you suddenly win $500,000 in the lottery, you will probably experience a significant and long term surge in your subjective well being. You will be able to feed and clothe your children without sinking further into debt. However, if you are top executive earning $250,000 a year and you win $1 million in the lottery, or your company board suddenly decide to double your salary, your surge is likely to last only a few weeks. According to the empirical finding, it's almost certainly not going to make a big difference to the way you feel over the long run. You will buy a snazzier car, move into a palatial home, get used to drinking Chateau Petrus instead of California Cabernet, but it will soon all seem routine and unexceptional. Another interesting finding is that the illness decreases happiness in the short term, but is a source of long-term distress only if a person's condition is constantly deteriorating, or if the disease involves ongoing and debilitating pain. People who are diagnosed with chronic illness such as diabetes are usually depressed for a while, but if the illness does not get worse, they adjust to their new condition and rate their happiness as highly as healthy people do. Imagine that Lucky and Luke are middle class twins who agree to take part in a subjective well being study on the way back from the psychology laboratory. Lucky's car is hit by a bus, leaving Lucky with a number of broken bones and permanently lame legs. Just as the rescue crew is cutting her out of the wreckage, the phone rings and Luke shouts that he has won the lottery's 10 lakh dollars jackpot. 2 years later, she will be limping and he will be a lot richer. But when the psychologist comes around for a follow up study, they are both likely to give the same answers they did on the morning of that fateful day. Family and the community seem to have more impact on our happiness than money and health. People with strong families who live in tight knit and supportive communities are significantly happier than people whose families are dysfunctional and who have never found a community to be part of. Marriage is particularly important. Repeated studies have found that there is very close correlation between good marriages and high subjective well-being and between bad marriages and misery. This hold true irrespective of economic or even physical condition. And an impecunious invalid surrounded by a loving spouse, a devoted family, and a warm community may well feel better than an alienated billionaire, provided that the invalid's poverty is not too severe and that his illness is not degenerative or painful. This raises the possibility that the immense improvement in material conditions over the last 2 centuries was offset by the collapse of family and the community. If so, the average person might well be no happier today than 1800. Even the freedom we value so highly may be working against us. We can choose our spouses, friends, and neighbors, but they can choose to leave us with the individual wielding unprecedented power to decide her own path in life. We find it even harder to make commitments. We thus live in an increasingly lonely world of unraveling communities and families. But the most important finding of all is that the happiness does not really depend on objective condition of either wealth, health, or even community. Rather, it depends on the correlation between objective condition and subjective expectation. If you want a bullock cart and get a bullock cart, you are content. If you want a brand new Ferrari and get only a second hand Fiat, you feel deprived. This is why winning the lottery has over time the same impact on people's happiness as a debilitating car accident. When things improve, expectation balloon, and consequently even dramatic improvement in objective condition can leave us dissatisfied. When things deteriorate, expectations shrink, and consequently, even a severe illness might leave you pretty much as happy as you were before. You might say that we did not need a bunch of psychologists and their questionnaires to discover this. Prophets, poets, and philosophers realized thousands of years ago that being satisfied with that what you already have is far more important than getting more of what you want. Still, it's nice when modern research, bolstered by lots of numbers and charts, reaches the same conclusions the ancient did. The crucial importance of human expectation has far-reaching implications for understanding the history of happiness. If happiness depended only on objective conditions such as wealth, health, and social relation, it would have been relatively easy to investigate its history. The finding that it depends on subjective expectation makes the task of historians far harder. We modern have an arsenal of tranquilizers and painkillers at our disposal, but our expectation of ease and pleasure and our intolerance of inconveniencing and discomfort have increased to such an extent that we may well suffer from pain more than our ancestors ever did. It's hard to accept this line of thinking. The problem is fallacy of reasoning embedded deep in our physics. When we try to guess or imagine how happy other people are now or how people in the past were, we inevitably imagine ourselves in their shoes. But that won't work because it based our expectation onto the material condition of others. In modern affluent societies, it is customary to take a shower and change your clothes every day. Medieval peasants went without washing for months on end and hardly ever changed their clothes. The very thought of living like that, filthy and reeking to the bone, is abhorrent to us. Yet medieval peasants seem not to have minded. They were used to the feel and smell of a long unlaundered shirt. It's not that they wanted a change of clothes but could not get it. They had what they wanted, so at least as far as clothing goes, they were content. That's not so surprising when you think of it. After all, our chimpanzees cousins seldom wash and never change their clothes, nor are we disgusted by the fact that our pet dogs and cats don't shower or change their coats daily? We pat, hug, and kiss them all the same. Small children in affluent societies often dislike showering, and it takes them years of education and parental discipline to adopt this supposedly attractive custom. It is all a matter of expectations. If happiness is determined by the expectation, then two pillars of our society, mass media and the advertising industry, may unwittingly be depleting the globe's reservoirs of contentment. If you were an 18-year-old youth in a small village 5,000 years ago, you would probably think you were good looking because there were only 50 other men in your village, and most of them were either old, scared, and wrinkled, or still little kids. But if you are a teenager today, you are a lot more likely to feel inadequate. Even if the other guys at school are an ugly lot, you don't measure yourself against them but against the movie stars, athletes, and supermodels you see all day on television, Facebook, and giant billboards. So maybe third world content is fomented not merely by poverty, disease, corruption, and political oppression, but also by mere exposure to first world standard. The average Egyptian was far less likely to die from starvation, plague, or violence under Hosni Mubarak than under Ramses II or Cleopatra. Never had the material condition of most Egyptian been so good. You would think that they would have been dancing in the street in 2011 thanking Allah for their good fortune. Instead, they rose up furiously to overthrow Mubarak. They were not comparing themselves to their ancestors under the pharaohs, but rather to their contemporaries in Obama's America. If that's the case, even immortality might lead to discontent. Suppose science comes up with cures for all diseases, effective anti-aging therapies, and regenerative treatment that keep people indefinitely young. In all likelihood, the immediate result will be an unprecedented epidemic of anger and anxiety. Those unable to afford the new miracle treatment, the vast majority of people will be beside themselves with rage. Throughout the history, the poor and the oppressed comforted themselves with the thought that at least death is even handed, that the rich and the powerful will also die. The poor will not be comfortable with the thought that they have to die while the rich will remain young and beautiful forever. But the tiny minority able to afford the new treatments will not be euphoric either. They will have much to be anxious about. Although the new therapies could extend life and youth, they cannot revive corpses. How dreadful to think that I and my loved ones can live forever, but only if we don't get hit by a truck or blown to smithereens by a terrorist. Potentially a mortal, people are likely to grow averse to taking even the slightest risk, and the agony of losing a spouse, child, or close friend will be unbearable. Subchapter Chemical Happiness. Social scientists distribute subjective well being questionnaires and correlate the result with socio-economic factors such as wealth and political freedom. Biologists use the same questionnaires but correlate the answer people give them with biochemical and genetic factors. Their findings are shocking. Biologists hold that our mental and emotional world is governed by the biochemical mechanism shared by millions of years of evolution. Like all other mental states, our subjective well being is not determined by the external parameters such as salary, social relations, or political rights. Rather, it is determined by a complex system of nerves, neurons, synapses, and various biochemical substances such as serotonin, dopamine, and oxytocin. Nobody is ever made happy by winning the lottery, buying a house, getting a promotion, or even finding true love. People are made happy by one thing and one thing only: pleasant sensation in their bodies. A person who just won the lottery or found new love and jumps from joy is not really reacting to the money or the lover. She is reacting to the various hormones coursing through her bloodstream and to the storm of electric signals flashing between different parts of her brain. Unfortunately, for all hope of creating heaven or earth, our internal biochemical system seems to be programmed to keep happiness level relatively constant. There are no natural selection for happiness such a happy hermit's genetic line will go extend as the gene of a pair of any anxious parent get carried on the next generation. Happiness and misery play a role in evolution only to the extent that they encourage or discourage survival and reproduction. Perhaps it's not surprising then that evolution has molded us to be neither too miserable nor too happy. It enables us to enjoy a momentary rush of pleasant sensation, but these never last forever. Sooner or later, they subside and give place to unpleasant sensation. For example, evolution provided pleasant feeling as rewards to males who spread their genes by having sex with fertile females. If sex were not accompanied by such pleasure, few males would bother. At the same time, evolution made sure that these pleasant feelings quickly subsided. If orgasms were to last forever, the very happy males would die of hunger for lack of interest in food and would not take the trouble to look for additional fertile females. Some scholars compare human biochemistry to an air conditioning system that keeps the temperature constant come heat wave or snowstorm. Even might momentarily change the temperature, but the air conditioning system always return the temperature to the same set point. Some air conditioning systems are set at 25 degrees Celsius, others are set at 20 degrees. Human happiness conditioning systems also differ from person to person. On a scale from 1 to 10, some people are born with a cheerful biochemical system that allows their mood to swing between level 6 and 10, stabilizing with time at 8. Such a person is quite happy even if she lives in a alienating big city, loses all her money in a stock exchange and crash and is diagnosed with a diabetes. Other people are cursed with a gloomy biochemistry that swings between 3 and 7 and stabilizes at 5. Such an unhappy person remains depressed even if she enjoys the support of a tight knit community, wins millions in the lottery, and is as healthy as an Olympic athlete. Indeed, even if our gloomy friend wins $50 million in the athlete, indeed, even if our gloomy friend wins $50 million in the morning, discover the cure for both AIDS and cancer by noon, makes peace between Israelis and Palestinians that afternoon, and then in the evening reunites with her long lost child who disappeared years ago, she would still be incapable of experiencing anything beyond level 7 happiness. Her brain is simply not built for accelerations, come what may. Think for a moment of your family and friends. You know some people who remain relatively joyful no matter what befalls them. And then there are those who are always disgruntled no matter what gifts the world lays at their feet. We tend to believe that if we could just change our workplace, get married, finish writing that novel, buy a new car, or repay the mortgage, we would be on top of the world. Yet, when we get what we desire, we don't seem to be any happier. Buying cars and writing novels do not change our biochemistry. They can startle it for a fleeting moment, but it is soon back to its set point. How can this be squared with the above mentioned psychological and sociological finding that far, for example, married people are happier on average than singles? First, these findings are correlations. The direction of cautions may be the opposite of what some researchers have assumed. It is true that married people are happier than singles and divorcees, but that does not necessarily mean that marriage produces happiness. It could be that happiness causes marriages, or more correctly, that serotonin, dopamine, and oxytocin brings about and maintain a marriage. People who are born with a cheerful biochemistry are generally happy and content. Such people are more attractive spouses and consequently they have a greater chance of getting married. They are also less likely to divorce because it is far easier to live with a happy and content spouse than with a depressed and dissatisfied one. Consequently, it's true that married people are happier on average than singles, but a single woman prone to gloom because of her biochemistry would not necessarily become happier if she were to hook up with the husband. In addition, most biologists are not fanatics. They maintain that happiness is determined mainly by biochemistry, but they agree that psychological factors also have their place. Our mental conditioning system has some freedom of movement within a predetermined borders. It is almost impossible to exceed the upper and lower emotional boundaries, but marriage and divorce can have an impact in the area between the two. Somebody born with an average of level 5 happiness would never dance wildly in the street, but a good marriage should enable her to enjoy level 7 from time to time and to avoid the despondency of level 3. If we accept the biological approach to happiness, then history turns out to be of minor importance since most historical events have had no impact on our biochemistry. History can change the external stimuli that cause serotonin to be secreted, yet it does not change the resulting serotonin levels, and hence it cannot make people happier. Compare a medieval French peasant to a modern Persian banker. The peasant lived in an unheated mud hut overlooking the local pigsty, while the banker goes home to splendid penthouse with all the latest technological gadgets and a view to the Champs-Elysees. Intuitively, we would expect the banker to be much happier than the peasant. However, mud huts, penthouses, and the Champs-Elysees don't really determine our mood. Serotonin does. When the medieval peasant completed the construction of his mud hut, his brain neurons secreted serotonin, bringing it up to the level X. When in 2014 the banker made the last payment on his wonderful penthouse, brain neurons secreted a similar amount of serotonin, bringing it up to a similar level X. It's make no difference to the brain that the penthouse is far more comfortable than the mud hut. The only thing that the matter is that at present the level of serotonin is X. Consequently, the banker would not be one iota happier than his great grandfather, the poor medieval peasant. This is true not only for private lives but also of great collective events. Take, for example, the French Revolution. The revolutionaries were busy. They executed the king, gave lands to the peasants, declared the rights of man, abolished noble privileges, and waged war against the whole of Europe. Yet none of that changed French biochemistry. Consequently, despite all the political, social, ideological, and economic upheavals brought about by the revolution, its impact on French happiness was small. Those who won a cheerful biochemistry in the genetic lottery were just as happy before the revolution as after. Those with a gloomy biochemistry complained about Robespierre and Napoleon with the same bitterness with which they earlier complained about Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette. If so, what good was the French Revolution? If people did not become any happier, then what was the point of all that chaos, fear, blood, and war? Biologists would never have stormed the Bastille. People think that this political revolution or that social reform will make them happier, but their biochemistry tricks them time and again. There is only one historical development that has real significance today when we finally realize that the keys to happiness are in the hands of our biochemical system. We can stop wasting our time on politics and social reforms, putschs and ideologies, and focus instead on the only thing that can make us truly happy: manipulating our biochemistry. If we invest billions in understanding our brain chemistry and developing appropriate treatments, we can make people far happier than ever before without any need of revolutions. Prozac, for example, does not change regimes, but by raising serotonin level, it lifts people out of their depression. Nothing captures the biological argument better than the famous New Age slogan, "Happiness begins within." Money, social status, plastic surgery, beautiful houses, powerful positions, none of these will bring you happiness. Lasting happiness comes only from serotonin, dopamine, and oxytocin. In Aldous Huxley's dystopian novel Brave New World, published in 1932 at the height of the Great Depression, happiness is the supreme value, and psychiatric drugs replace the police and Ballot as the foundation of politics. Each day, each person takes a dose of soma, a synthetic drug which makes people happy without harming their productivity and efficiency. The world state that governs the entire globe is never threatened by wars, revolution, strikes, or demonstrations because all people are supremely content with their current conditions. Whatever they may be, Huxley's vision of the future is far more troubling than the George Orwell 1984. Huxley's world seems monstrous to most readers, but it is hard to explain why everybody is happy all the time. What could be wrong with that? Subchapter The Meaning of Life. Huxley's disconcerting world is based on the biological assumption that happiness equals pleasure. To be happy is no more and no less than experiencing pleasant bodily sensations. Since our biochemistry limits the value and duration of these sensations, the only way to make people experience a high level of happiness over an extended period of time is to manipulate their biochemical system. But the definition of happiness is contested by some scholars. In a famous study, Daniel Kahneman, winner of the Nobel Prize in Economics, asked people to recount a typical work day, going through it episode by episode and evaluating how much they enjoyed or disliked each moment. He discovered what seems to be paradox in most people's view of their lives. Take the world involved in raising a child. Kahneman would found that when counting moments of joy and moments of drudgery, bringing up a child turns to be a rather unpleasant affair. It consists largely of changing nappies, washing dishes, and dealing with the temper tantrums, which nobody likes to do. Yet most parents declare that their children are their chief source of happiness. Does it mean that the people don't really know what's good for them? That's one option. Another is that the findings demonstrate that the happiness is not the surplus of pleasant or unpleasant moments. Rather, happiness consists in seeing one's life in its entirety as meaningful and worthwhile. There is an important cognitive and ethical component to happiness. Our values make all the difference to whether we see ourselves as miserable slaves to a baby dictator or or loving, nurturing a new life. As Nietzsche put it, if you have why to live, you can bear almost anyhow. A meaningful life can be extremely satisfying even in the midst of hardship, whereas a meaningless life is a terrible ordeal no matter how comfortable it is. Though people in all cultures and eras have felt the same type of pleasures and pain, the meaning they have ascribed to their experiences has probably varied widely. If so, the history of happiness might have been far more turbulent than biologists imagine. It's a conclusion that does not necessarily favor modernity. Assessing life minute by minute, medieval people certainly had it rough. However, if they believed the promise of everlasting bliss in the afterlife, they may well have viewed their lives as far more meaningful and worthwhile than modern secular people who, in the long term, can expect nothing but complete and meaningless oblivion. Asked, are you satisfied with your life as a whole? People in the Middle Ages might have scored quite highly in the subjective well being questionnaire. So, our medieval ancestors were happy because they found meaning to life in collective delusion about the afterlife. Yes, as long as nobody punctured their fantasies, why should not they? As far as we can tell from a purely scientific viewpoint, human life has absolutely no meaning. Humans are the outcome of blind evolutionary processes that operate without goal or purpose. Our actions are not part of some divine cosmic plan, and if planet Earth were to blow up tomorrow morning, the universe would probably keep going about its business as usual. As far as we can tell, as at this point, human subjectivity would not be missed. Hence, any meaning that people ascribe to their lives in just a delusion. The otherworldly meaning medieval people found in their lives were no more deluded than the modern humanist, nationalist, and capitalist meanings. Modern people find the scientist who says her life is meaningful because she increases the store of human knowledge, the soldier who declares that his life is meaningful because he fights to defend his homeland, and the entrepreneurs who finds meaning in building a new company are no less delusional than their medieval counterparts who found meaning in reading scriptures, going on a crusade, or building a new cathedral. So perhaps happiness is synchronizing one's personal delusions of meaning with the prevailing collective delusions. As long as many personal narrative is in line with the narratives of the people around me, I can convince myself that my life is meaningful and find happiness in that convictions. This is quite a depressing conclusion. Does happiness really depend on the self delusion? Subtopic now, the self. If happiness is based on a feeling pleasant sensation, then in order to be happier, we need to re engineer our biochemical system. If happiness is based on feeling that life is meaningful, then in order to be happier, we need to delude ourselves more effectively. Is there a third alternative? Both the above views share the assumption that happiness is some sort of subjective feeling, and that in order to judge people's happiness, all we need to do is ask them how they feel. To many of us, that seems logical because the dominant religion of our age is liberalism. Liberalism sanctifies the subjective feeling of individuals. It views these feelings as the supreme source of authority. What is good and what is bad, what is beautiful and what is ugly, what ought to be and what ought not to be, are all determined by what each one of us feels. Liberal politics is based on the idea that the voters know best, and there is no need for Big Brother to tell us what is good for us. Liberal economics is based on the idea that the customer is always right. Liberal art declares that beauty is in the eye of the beholder. Students in liberal schools and universities are taught to think for themselves. Commercials urge us to just do it. Action films, stage dramas, operas, novels, and catchy pop songs indoctrinate us constantly. Be true to yourself, listen to yourself, follow your heart. John Jacques Rawson stated this view most classically: what I feel to be good is good, what I feel to be bad is bad. People who have been raised from infancy on a diet of such slogans are prone to believe that happiness is a subjective feeling and that each individual best knows whether she is happy or miserable. Yet, this view is unique to liberalism. Most religions and ideologies throughout the history stated that there are objective yardsticks for goodness and beauty and for how things ought to be. They were suspicious of the feelings and preferences of the ordinary person. At the entrance of the temple of Apollo or at Delphi, pilgrims were greeted by the inscriptions "No self." The implication was that the average person is ignorant of his true self and is therefore likely to be ignorant of true happiness. Freud would probably concur, and so would Christian theologians. Saint Paul and Saint Augustine knew perfectly well that if you ask people about it, most of them would prefer to have sex than pray to God. Does that prove that having sex is the key to happiness? Not according to the Paul and Augustine. It proves only that humankind is sinful by nature and that people are easily seduced by Shaitan. From a Christian viewpoint, the vast majority of the people are in more or less the same situation as heroin addicts. Imagine that a psychologist on a study of happiness among drug users. He polls them and finds that they declare, every single one of them, that they are only happy when they shoot up. Would the psychologist publish a paper declaring that the heroin is the key to happiness? The idea that feelings are not to be trusted is not restricted to Christianity. At least when it comes to the value of feelings, even Darwin and Dawkins might find common ground with St. Paul and St. Augustine. According to the selfish gene theory, natural selection makes people like other organisms choose what is good for the reproduction of their genes, even it is bad for them as individuals. Most males spend their lives toiling, worrying, competing, and fighting instead of enjoying peaceful bliss because their DNA manipulates them for its own selfish aims. Like Satan, DNA uses fleeting players to tempt people and place them in its power. Most religions and philosophies have consequently take a very different approach to happiness than liberalism does. The Buddhist position is particularly interesting. Buddhism has assigned the question of happiness more importance than perhaps any other human creed. For 2500 years, Buddhists have systematically studied the essence and causes of happiness, which is why there is a growing interest among the scientific community both in their philosophy and their meditation practices. Buddhism shares the basic insight of the biological approach to the happiness, namely that happiness results from processes occurring within one's body and not from events in the outside the world. However, starting from the same inside, Buddhism reaches very different conclusions. According to the Buddhism, most people identify happiness with pleasant feeling, while identifying suffering with unpleasant feelings. People consequently ascribe immense importance to what they feel, craving to experience more and more pleasures while avoiding pain. Whatever we do throughout our lives, whether scratching our leg, sitting slightly in the chair, or fighting world war, we are just trying to get pleasant feeling. The problem, according to the Buddhism, is that our feelings are no more than fleeting vibration, changing every moment like the ocean waves. If 5 minutes ago I felt joyful and purposeful, now these feelings are gone and I might well feel sad and dejected. So if I want to experience pleasant feeling, I have to constantly chase them while driving away the unpleasant feeling. Even if I succeed, I immediately have to start all over again without ever getting any lasting reward for my troubles. What is so important about obtaining such ephemeral prizes? Why struggle so hard to achieve something that disappears almost as soon as it arises? According to the Buddhism, the root of suffering is neither the feeling of pain nor of sadness nor even of meaninglessness. Rather, the real root of suffering is the never ending and pointless pursuit of ephemeral feelings, which causes us to be in a constant state of tension, restlessness, and dissatisfaction. Due to this pursuit, the meaning is never satisfied. Even when experiencing pleasure, it is not content because it fears this feeling might soon disappear and craves that these feelings should stay and intensify. People are liberated from suffering not when they experience this or that fleeting pleasure, but rather when they understand the impermanent nature of all their feelings and stop craving them. This is the aim of Buddhist meditation practices. In meditation, you are supposed to closely observe your mind and body, witness the ceaseless arising and passing of all your feelings, and realize how pointless it is to pursue them. When the pursuit stops, the mind becomes very relaxed, clear, and satisfied. All kinds of feelings go on arising and passing: joy, anger, boredom, lust. But once you stop craving particular feelings, you can just accept them for what they are. You live in the present moment instead of fantasizing about what might have been. The resulting serenity is so profound that those who spend their lives in the frenzied pursuit of pleasant feeling can hardly imagine it. It is like a man standing for decades on the seashore, embarrassing certain good waves and trying to prevent them from disintegrating while simultaneously pushing back bad waves to prevent them from getting near him. Day in, day out, the man stands on the beach driving himself crazy with this fruitless exercise. Eventually, he sits down on the sand and just allows the waves to come and go as they please. How peaceful! This idea is so alien to modern liberal culture that when Western New Age movement encountered Buddhist insights, they translated them into liberal terms, thereby turning them on their head. New Age cults frequently argue happiness does not depend on external condition; it depends only on what we feel inside. People should stop pursuing depends only on what we feel inside. People should stop pursuing external achievements such as wealth and status and connect instead with their inner feelings, or more succinctly, happiness begins within. This is exactly what biologists argue, but more or less the opposite of what Buddha said. Buddha agreed with modern biology and New Age movements that happiness is independent of external conditions. Yet, this more important and far more profound insight was that true happiness is also independent of our inner feelings. Indeed, the more significance we give our feelings, the more we crave them and more we suffer. Buddha's recommendation was to stop not only the pursuit of external achievement but also the pursuit of inner feelings. To sum up, subjective well being questionnaires identify our well being with our subjective feelings and identify the pursuit of happiness with the pursuit of particular emotional states. In contrast, for many traditional philosophies and religions, such as Buddhism, the key to happiness is to know the truth about yourself, to understand who or what you really are. Most people wrongly identify themselves with their feelings, thoughts, likes, and dislikes. When they feel anger, they think, I am angry. This is my anger. They consequently spend their life avoiding some kinds of feelings and pursuing others. They never realize that they are not their feelings and that the relentless pursuit of particular feeling just trap them in misery. If this is so, then our entire understanding of the history of happiness might be misguided. Maybe it is not so important whether people's expectations are fulfilled and whether they enjoy pleasant feelings. The main question is whether people know the truth about themselves. What evidence do we have that people today understand this truth any better than ancient foragers or medieval peasants? Scholars began to study the history of happiness only a few years ago, and we are still formulating initial hypotheses and searching for appropriate research methods. It's much too early to adopt rigid conclusions and end a debate that's hardly yet begun. What is important is to get to know as many different approaches as possible and to ask the right question. Most history books focus on the ideas of great thinkers, the bravery of warriors, the charity of saints, and the creativity of artists. They have much to tell about the weaving and unraveling of social structure, about the rise and fall of empires, about the discovery and spread of technologies. Yet they say nothing about how all this influenced the happiness and suffering of individuals. This is the biggest lacuna in our understanding of history. We had better start filling it.